Thank you, Madam President. With the unemployment rate...
Excuse me, Senator. There's a quorum.
May I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. With the unemployment rate hovering above 9% nationwide and at almost 11% in my home state of Rhode Island, job creation must continue to be our #1 priority as lawmakers. It disappoints me that Republicans chose politics over job creation yesterday when they filibustered legislation that would have reauthorized the Economic Development Administration, an agency dedicated to restoring economically distressed regions to prosperity. In the past, this bill has been reauthorized and supported broadly, indeed by unanimous consent. It is the 4th jobs bill that the minority has chosen to obstruct. And I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will reconsider their tactics. If not, we may have to reconsider ours and force some votes on job creation measures without this litany of irrelevant amendments that have bogged down and obstructed the previous jobs bill we've tried to get action on. Out-of-work Americans are hurting right now, and they want us to act to help create jobs. I rise today to introduce a measure that would do just that. I've heard from dozens of Rhode Island business owners that business is picking up a bit, but they are still concerned that the recovery may be temporary, and that discourages them from hiring additional workers. I spoke with one such small business owner on Monday. I visited Donna Vincent during a tour of her Cranston, Rhode Island company, Tedco. Tedco makes and stamps metal components for the automotive, aerospace, and communications industries. It employed 13 people before the recession struck in 2008. Now it's down to 8 employees. Donna and Tedco's general manager, Barbara Gallonio, would like to start hiring more workers, but they worry that business could slow down again. They told me they've been waiting to hire, wanting to hire, and for months saying to themselves, well, what if this and what if that? And they've just been on the border of hiring. The legislation that I've introduced today, the Job Creation Tax Credit Act of 2011, would give Donna and thousands of other business owners nationwide greater security as they look forward to building their workforces. The bill would provide refundable tax credits for employers to hire new workers now. The way it would work is that for each qualified hire made in 2011, the business would receive a tax credit equal to 15% of the wages paid to the new employee. If the new employee remained employed, or if the business were to hire additional employees in 2012, the business would be eligible for a 10% tax credit on those employees' wages next year. And because these tax credits would be refundable, businesses would benefit from them even if they are not currently profitable. One of the problems with struggling businesses that are not sure how much profit they're going to make if they're right on the edge, giving them a tax credit doesn't help because they have no tax against which to take the credit. A refundable tax credit comes to the business despite of that. The higher credit in 2011, I expect, would encourage employers to hire new workers as soon as possible. And the additional credit in 2012 would encourage retaining those employees and additional workforce expansion. To help those Americans who are struggling to find work, qualified hires would be defined as new employees who've been unemployed for at least 60 days prior to getting hired. This Job Creation Tax Credit Act would continue the job creation sparked by the Hire Act of 2010, which included somewhat different tax incentives for new hiring. Economist Mark Zandi has estimated that the Hire Act created 250,000 new jobs, 250,000 families with a paycheck coming in. And the larger financial incentives in this new bill would continue to dent the unemployment numbers in Rhode Island and nationwide. The previous Hire Act, sponsored by Senators Schumer and Hatch, received wide bipartisan support. And I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support the Job Creation Tax Credit Act as well. Because right now, we cannot forget that too many unemployed Americans are hurting. Too many are out of work. Too many are out of work through no fault of their own. Indeed, too many of them are still out of work because of the cascade of misery that washed across this country from the Wall Street meltdown. And there may be a lot of blame to go around on that, but none of it attaches to the workers who got caught in that cascade of misery. And of course, too many families are struggling just to make ends meet week to week. We must continue fighting for them by using every tool at our disposal, including these new tax incentives, to get our economy moving and to help businesses start hiring. Again, this is a bill whose strategy has been a proven success in the past, that has been approved by this body in the past, that has had bipartisan support in the past, and that addresses the most important issue facing our country right now, and that is putting people back to work, rekindling our economy, and getting folks into jobs. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, on behalf of Senator McCain, I call up Amendment 493 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Illinois, Mr. Kirk, for Mr. McCain, proposes amendment number 493.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
I ask to be recognized for 10 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, under General Petraeus, the deployment of a local army is critical to winning a war. In Iraq, he used extra U.S. troops to sustain military momentum against an enemy until a well-trained local army was trained and ready for action. Petraeus had the time he needed to stand up a 500,000-man local army and then won the war. This has also been his model for Afghanistan. While Iraq and Afghanistan differ, the military challenge was the same: to train and deploy a local army that could sustain a fight until victory. Now, starting with nothing, the United States and our NATO allies set a goal of building an Afghan army and police force to eventually number 400,000. By reaching this goal, the combat mission of the U.S. and other NATO forces would disappear. We would remain helpful with supplies, repair, and intelligence, but not frontline combat. I agreed with President Obama's decision to surge to Afghanistan, and I was in the audience to show my support when he delivered a historic address at West Point. By following the recommendations of General Petraeus, Secretary Gates, and others, President Obama gave the U.S. and our NATO allies the time needed to vastly expand the Afghan police and army. Unfortunately, the President has changed course from establishing a sufficient Afghan security force before scaling down our military presence. To date, the Afghan police and army are short of their 400,000-man goal. As of April, there were 284,000 in both services, well over 100,000 people short. Overall, the Afghan army loses 32% of its personnel a year, while its police lose 23%. To expand the security forces, losses must be held to just 24% annually. Therefore, according to our National Military Training Mission Afghanistan, the commander of that training effort, General Caldwell, must train 23 Afghans for every 10 to be deployed. We find key shortfalls in the officer corps and among non-commissioned officers. To date, 82% of Afghan officer billets are not filled, along with 85% of non-commissioned sergeants and corporals. The Afghan Army is also short of recruits from the communities where the fighting is most difficult. Only 3% of the Afghan Army was born in the southern Pashtun regions where Afghan leaders traditionally originate. The Afghan Army is also lacking in literacy. In 2008, only 14% of Afghan military personnel could read or write. Now, thanks to General Caldwell, that number has grown to 85% in both police and Army. One of the critical factors in training an Afghan Army that can win this war is the number of NATO trainers. To date, the training command lacks over 700 trainers due to personnel shortfalls among our NATO allies. Each of these facts paints a clear picture of a work in progress, but one that is about to be strained by the President's decision to leave Afghanistan 2 years too early. Under the original Petraeus plan, the United States and NATO would have deployed an Afghan police and military numbering 400,000 by 2014. Having trained together for a year or more, these Afghan units would likely endure the stress of combat and deliver victory in 2015 or 2016. Unfortunately, the President has rejected his general's recommendation and decided to leave early, withdrawing one U.S. brigade combat team right away. Our NATO allies expressed quiet concern about this departure. U.S. and local commanders will have about 12% of their combat power taken off the battlefield right away. The President will then remove 2 more brigade combat teams by the election day in 2012, leaving U.S. and local commanders with only 66% of the current combat power. These actions will severely strain the Afghan police and army, just as Afghanistan prepares for a new presidential election. It also provides some hope for the Taliban, whose strategy may be a 12-month rest and refit of their operations to then re-enter the battlefield against a much weaker enemy in 2013. We learned a painful lesson when we ignored Afghanistan in 1992. Without any domestic oil or a coastline, the United States paid no attention to the rise of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And we paid an awful price for that policy on September 11, 2001. In my view, the lesson of that day should move us to realize that the Petraeus plan should have been fully implemented and not ended early. Now, separately, I would like to take a moment to applaud our Treasury Department, and especially our Acting Undersecretary, David Cohen, for moving decisively today to designate Iran Air and a major Iranian port operator, Tidewater, responsible for facilitating Iran's transfer of weapons and other proliferation activities. Both of these Treasury designations will significantly restrict shipping to and from Iran, and will put even more pressure on the Iranian economy. Undersecretary Cohen has proven himself to be a worthy successor of former Undersecretary Levy, and he has my confidence. In the weeks ahead, I urge the administration to move forward with our allies in Europe and Asia to implement a comprehensive strategy to collapse the Central Bank of Iran. The Central Bank of Iran facilitates the operation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Ministry of Intelligence Services, and lies at the center of Iran's strategy to circumvent international sanctions. It's time for the United States and our allies to decapitate the central bank of Iran and to place unprecedented stress on the Iranian economy. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.
President,
Senator from Vermont.
I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
President, I think many Americans understand that we are at a pivotal moment in American history. And decisions that will be made right here in the Senate, decisions that will be made in the House, decisions that will be made in the White House regarding the budget and how we deal with the debt ceiling will impact virtually every American. Our children, working families, seniors, virtually every American for decades to come. The stakes are huge. The debate is not just about a budget, but the question of which direction America goes forward in. Today, the Republican leaders, Eric Cantor in the House, John Kyle here in the Senate, withdrew from the bipartisan budget talks that have been led by Vice President Biden. And Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader here in the Senate, was quoted as saying, no, I beg your pardon, Senator Kyle said, the White House and Democrats are insisting on job-killing tax hikes and new spending. President Obama needs to decide between his goal of higher taxes or a bipartisan plan to address our deficit. He can't have both. But we need to hear from him. End of quote. We need to hear from the President. Well, I agree with Senators Kyle and Senator McConnell that we need, the American people need, the Senate needs to hear from President Obama on this enormously important issue. But I believe that we need to hear from the President in a very different way than what Senator Kyle and Senator McConnell and Congressman Cantor want to hear. Here is where we are in America today, and this is what the debate is about. Virtually every American understands that to a very significant degree, the middle class in this country is disappearing. Median family income has gone down by $2,500 in the last 10 years. Many millions of workers today are earning lower wages than they used to earn. They are moving in the wrong direction. In a recent 25-year period ending in 2005, 80% of all new income did not go to the middle class, went to the people on top. So the overall dynamic of America now, a middle class collapsing, poverty increasing, young people finding it very, very difficult to get decent paying jobs. And while all of that is going on, the people on top have never had it so good. Almost all new income is going to the top 1%. Interesting piece in the Washington Post this Sunday talking about the growing gap between the very, very rich, everybody else, Wall Street, whose thievery and illegal behavior and recklessness caused this recession, now making more money for their executives than they did before the recession that they helped cause. Top 1% today earning more income than the bottom 50%. Top 1% alone earning 22% of all income in America. Top 400 individuals in this country own more wealth than the bottom 150 million. And I know, Mr. President, you have made the point about the gross inequities and unfairness in our tax system, that while the middle class is sinking, the people on top have been able to enjoy effective tax rates that are the lowest in recorded history, that janitors, that cops, that nurses, that working people today are paying an effective tax rate that is higher than millionaires and billionaires. That's the reality economically that this country faces today, and then that is the reality that we have to deal as we move toward a budget. Most Americans, every single poll that I have seen, says what is obvious, that if we are going to address the deficit crisis, it must be done in a way that is fair, that everybody participates in. Now, our Republican friends have a very unusual idea about how to solve the deficit crisis. Yes, they say the rich are getting richer. Yes, they say corporations are doing phenomenally well. Some are making billions of dollars in profits, not paying a nickel in taxes. Yes, they understand the gap between very rich, everybody else is going wider. And their quaint and interesting idea in the midst of that context is that while the rich get richer, they should not be asked to contribute one nickel, not 1 penny for deficit reduction. Quite the contrary. Under the Republican budget passed in the House, the so-called Ryan budget, while the rich get richer and corporations enjoy record-breaking profits, their budget proposes $1 trillion more in tax breaks for the rich and large corporations. Meanwhile, while the middle class disappears and poverty increases, their idea for deficit reduction is to make savage cuts in programs that the middle class and working families depend upon to survive. Under the Republican budget, they would end Medicare as we know it in a 10-year period. They propose to give a senior citizen an $8,000 check, a voucher, and have that senior go out and get a plan, insurance plan, with a private insurance company. Mr. President, you tell me what kind of plan a 70-year-old person dealing with cancer or another illness is going to get with an $8,000 voucher. Are they living in the real world? Do they know what hospital care costs today? You eat up $8,000 in the first day. And yet that is what a senior is supposed to live on for health care for a year. But it's not only ending Medicare as we know it in order to give tax breaks to billionaires, it's savage cuts in Medicaid. Half the people on Medicaid are children. We are the only country today in the industrialized world that doesn't guarantee health care to all of its people. 50 million people uninsured. You cut Medicaid by $700 billion over a 10-year period, tens of millions more, including a lot of kids. No health insurance. They get sick. Working-class parents, where are they going to get the care? How do they get the care? Well, I guess we got to do that in order to give a tax break to a large corporation that already is not paying anything in taxes. Mr. President, let me just mention for a moment what is a fair way to move toward deficit reduction, and a way that the American people overwhelmingly support. You go out and you ask the American people, do you think it makes sense in terms of addressing the serious problem of deficit reduction to give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the richest people and make savage cuts in programs that working people need? Health care, education, nutrition, environmental protection. Overwhelming majority of the American people say that is nuts, does not make any sense. We must not go in that direction. So when my Republican friends in the leadership say, well, there's a lot of responsibility now on the President. The President has got to decide which direction he wants this country to go. They are right. And my hope is that the President of the United States listens to the American people and demands that deficit reduction consists of shared sacrifice, that we move to a deficit reduction not just on the backs of the elderly and the children and the sick and the poor, but that everybody, I know, even people who make large campaign contributions, I know that's heresy to say here on the floor of the Senate, but maybe even large corporations who buy and sell politicians, maybe they should be asked to contribute toward deficit reduction. Maybe billionaires who have more money than they're going to spend in 100 lifetimes might be asked to pay somewhat more in taxes before we throw children off of health insurance or deny nutrition to low-income seniors. Mr. President, there are many, many ways to go forward in addressing the deficit crisis that is fair, that does not decimate programs that working families depend upon, especially in the middle of a severe recession. And let me just mention very, very few. We should not extend the tax breaks that President Bush gave the wealthiest people in this country. That's it. You got a $1.5 trillion deficit, $14+ trillion national debt. Sorry, we can't afford it. These guys have already received huge tax breaks. No more. Can't afford it. We have to take a hard look at our defense budget. We've got to begin bringing the troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan a lot faster than the President has indicated. The defense budget has tripled since 1997. It has tripled. It is time to make cuts in the defense budget, and we can do that while maintaining our strong defense capabilities. Mr. President, there are studies out there which indicate that large corporations and wealthy individuals are stashing huge amounts of money in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, and collectively they're avoiding paying $100 billion in taxes to the U.S. Treasury. I think that that is absurd. We've got to end those loopholes. They have got to pay their fair share of taxes. And I can go on and on in terms of the loopholes that exist for corporate America, which have got to be closed, the absurdity of the richest people in this country having an effective, a real tax rate lower than middle-class people. But here's the issue. If the Republicans walk away from those negotiations, the President of the United States has got to accept that challenge. He's got to go out to the American people. He's got to rally the American people around a deficit reduction program which calls for shared sacrifice. That is what the call of the moment is, and I hope that the President does that. And with that, Mr. President, I apparently will be reading a short statement. Mr. President, on behalf of Senator Akaka, I call up Amendment number 512.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, for Mr. Akaka, proposes an amendment numbered 512. On page 48, strike
Mr. President, I would
439.
ask consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I am reading in press reports that some of my colleagues across the aisle are advocating another stimulus package, sometimes called government investment, otherwise called spending taxpayers' money that we don't have and borrowing it from our children, and most immediately from the Chinese that own $1 trillion of our national debt. It is astonishing to me that after the last stimulus package early in 2009 failed to meet the President's own stated target of keeping unemployment to 8% or lower, that some of our colleagues are trying to double down on a bad deal by advocating more stimulus when 43 cents out of every dollar that's being spent in America today is borrowed money. I mentioned that the President, in his speech on Afghanistan last night, said that the federal government needs to invest more. Well, I don't think anybody should be fooled by what he really means when he says the federal government must invest. The only money the federal government has is the money that comes from your wallet, from taxpayers, and when there's not enough money coming in to keep up with the reckless spending habits of Washington, D.C., then they simply borrow the money or print money that we don't have, and that's what investment means when the President talks about needing to invest more federal government money. On the same day the President spoke, the Congressional Budget Office released a report that shows the federal government spending spree is not sustainable and the nation's fiscal position is getting worse. I don't think that's breaking news. I think most Americans could tell you that was the case, at least intuitively, already. Over the last 2 years, the nation's debt has dramatically worsened. Gross federal debt is expected to equal 100% of our entire economy in just 3 months, well past the 90% threshold that many economists believe where the debt will seriously undermine economic growth. Some studies show that this increased debt, which crowds out private investment and borrowing, may result in the loss of at least 1 million jobs a year. But getting back to my initial point about this stimulus notion in the negotiations with Vice President Biden over raising the debt ceiling, it seems that many have forgotten the trillion-dollar stimulus package passed back in 2009, that the green shoots predicted never materialized, that the recovery summer never happened, and as I say, it failed to keep unemployment below the targeted rate of 8%, and indeed now it hovers nationwide at a rate of 9.1%. And it's much, much worse in many regions of the country. Only in Washington, D.C. would someone advocate a repetition of a program that we know has failed to meet its stated goals and was, I believe, a total flop. First of all, it was borrowed money, so it wasn't even spending money that we had. It was exacerbating an already dangerously high debt. The first stimulus failed for one reason, because of our massive deficits in jobs and our budget. And we know that the American people believe, as the Gallup organization tells us, that a large majority of Americans believe that spending too much money on unneeded and wasteful government programs is to blame for our federal budget deficit. And if you ask any business owner, anyone really outside of the Beltway, the reason why jobs are just not coming back, it's in large part because of the uncertainty of what's coming out of Washington, not only legislatively, but as a regulatory matter, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Labor, all of the alphabet soup of federal agencies that exist here in Washington, D.C. Instead of passing another unpaid-for stimulus plan or issuing more job-killing regulations, our focus should remain on ways to reduce and reform government spending and thereby help getting the economy moving again. In fact, I think we need to force the Congress and the federal government to live within its means by passing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And this should be the focus of our efforts here over the next couple of months as we tackle not only this unsustainable debt and these huge annual deficits, but as we look for ways to put a straitjacket on the federal government to make sure that it doesn't keep spending money that it doesn't have. No family, no business. Matter of fact, 49 states have balanced budget requirements. Only the federal government and only Congress can continue to spend money that we don't have. A balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution would permanently change Washington's behavior. So far, 47 senators in the United States Senate on this side of the aisle have endorsed and co-sponsored a balanced budget amendment, and we would invite our colleagues across the aisle to join us in this effort. We need to, in summary, unburden the economy from regulatory uncertainty, or in some cases the certainty that the bureaucracy will overreach and make it harder, not easier, to create jobs. We need to pass 3 trade agreements that should be pending before the Senate to help create more jobs here at home by producing things here that we can then sell abroad. And then we need to develop our domestic energy production. With the great gifts we've been given in this country, I know the presiding officer, coming from an energy-producing state, Alaska, agrees with me that we need to produce more domestic energy here at home, which will also have the added benefit of creating jobs right here in America, rather than continuing the bad habit and the dangerous habit of importing about 60% of our energy from abroad in some dangerous parts of the world. I just want to close with a couple of other thoughts, listening to my colleague from Vermont calling for shared sacrifice in meeting some of the deficit reduction plans. I would just suggest to the distinguished senator that 9.1% unemployment reflects a lot of sacrifice among a lot of people who can't find jobs in this bad economy. That's shared sacrifice, but that's a sacrifice that I know they and we would prefer they did not have to share. And when you don't have a job, it's pretty hard to make your mortgage payments. And when you can't make your mortgage payments, or you can't move because your mortgage is more expensive than the value of your home's underwater, you're simply stuck. And a lot of people are finding themselves defaulting on their mortgages and losing their home, which is usually the largest single investment any of us will make. But finally, I want to close on this thought. I want to ask my colleagues across the aisle who've been so critical of the proposals that have been made by the House of Representatives and others, where is your plan? Where is your budget? It's been 2 years since the United States Congress has passed a budget, since it's been in control of our Democratic friends. Where is your plan to save Medicare, which the Medicare trustees have said will go insolvent? That means there's more money going out than coming in by the year 2024. How do we keep the promise to our most vulnerable seniors that we will be there for them, that Medicare will be for them, if we don't do something to shore up this insolvent program? I unfortunately believe that the President is listening too closely to his political advisors rather than listening to those who are telling him, Mr. President, we have a problem that we need to solve. And the first place he ought to look for a proposed solution is his own bipartisan fiscal commission that reported back in December in a report 66 pages long. It's scary but important reading. The title of that is Moment of Truth. We are have reached a crossroads in this country where we simply can't kick the can down the road, where we can't keep spending money we don't have, where we can't keep relying upon communist China to buy our debt and to bail us out. We simply can't continue to pass these responsibilities on to our children and grandchildren. We have important promises to keep to our seniors, to make sure that that safety net of Medicare and Social Security is going to be there for them. But we can't do it unless we have willing partners join us across the aisle. And right now, the only one in this country who's in a position to make this happen is the President of the United States. But so far, the President has been AWOL on this issue. After he has issued his bipartisan fiscal commission, issued the report I referred to a moment ago in December of 2010, in the State of the Union speech, the President barely mentioned, if at all, this mounting crisis of debt and the problems with our pending insolvency of Medicare and Social Security. In his budget that the President proposed, it was never acted on by the Majority Leader or the Budget Committee on which I sit, In being in the minority, we can't force this issue. It can only happen if the chairman of the Budget Committee marks up a budget and if the majority leader, Senator Harry Reid, across the aisle will put it on the floor of the United States Senate where we can debate it and offer amendments. But they chose not to do so, relying instead on their political consultants that said, you know, if you offer a constructive proposal, there may be some across the aisle who will criticize it, and you know what, you may just have to take some hard votes. Well, anybody who's come to the United States Senate and who isn't willing to vote their convictions, whatever those convictions are, and be held accountable by their constituents back home, doesn't deserve to be in the United States Congress. And we're here to take hard votes and to make hard decisions, because it's not about us and our political career. It's not about the next election. It's about addressing these problems that we have been sent here to try to fix the best we can under the circumstances. And it is beyond unbelievable when I hear some of our colleagues across the aisle, this senior senator from New York, among others, talking about another stimulus spending as part of this debt reduction deal. And beyond that, we have the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee making clear that insistence on tax increases was an essential element of any deal on raising the debt limit. The Vice President himself was quoted as saying in the Politico publication, he said, the piece is most important to us Democrats, revenue. That's Washington speak. The word revenue is Washington speak for tax increases. Tax increases. The President and Republicans and Democrats got together after the last election and agreed to extend expiring tax provisions because all of us agreed on a bipartisan basis that the worst thing you could do for a fragile, recovering economy was to raise taxes on small businesses that are the engine of job creation and on individuals who would be able to then invest that money in starting a business or growing an existing business. There's a reason why the private sector is afraid of Washington, D.C., because they see these mounting debts and deficits, and they realize that one of the things that we might be tempted to do is to raise their taxes. And you know what? Their business model for their small business may not be able to withstand that tax increase that they didn't plan on, or the regulatory overreach of some federal Washington bureaucrat. So they're scared, and they're sitting on the sidelines. And two things we need to do the most are bring down that spending curve by reducing federal government spending, begin to attack that debt, and make sure we don't have to keep raising the credit limit on the nation's credit card, but rather we can bring it down and bring it within sustainable limits. That's one thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is take our boot off the neck of the private sector, the free enterprise system here in America, so they can create jobs, so they can grow their business, so they can pay their taxes, and we can begin to close the gap between what the federal government is spending and what the federal government brings in terms of revenue. In 2007, when our Democratic friends took control of the House and the Senate, President Bush was still President of the United States, our annual deficit was roughly 1.2% of our gross domestic product, or our whole economy, 1.2%. Today it's roughly 10%. But the reason it was 1.2% is not because we weren't spending a significant amount of money. We were. It was because the economy was booming and revenue to the federal treasury was at an all-time high. So that should tell us we need to do two things. We need to cut spending, not just raise taxes so Washington can spend some more and throw a wet blanket on the economy and the job creators, but we need to cut spending, fix these entitlement programs so we can keep our promise to our seniors who in many cases are relying upon these for their very livelihood. And then we need to get the economy moving again by growing the jobs in the private sector, by adopting a national energy policy that says we prefer domestic or American energy sources rather than those from abroad. And, Mr. President, we need to do it soon. And I'm saddened to see that as a result of the insistence on the part of the Vice President and our friends across the aisle that tax increases must be a part of any package of debt reduction that the Majority Leader in the House of Representatives and the Assistant Leader here in the Senate, Senator Kyle, have reached an impasse and said they don't see any point to continuing the negotiations at this point. I hope that the Vice President, indeed I hope the President of the United States himself, is the only Democrat who can get this deal done, will reconsider their approach and will say we will help work with Republicans to live within our means, reduce spending, and try to get our economy moving again so we can alleviate our children from the debt burden that now they are inheriting from us. Every child born in America today will come into this world with $46,000 roughly in debt that they owe. That's because of what we have been doing here in Washington, or rather what we have not been doing, which is living within our means. It's time to do that, and we need to work together to solve the problem. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President, we had an announcement today that the so-called Biden talks have broken down. It's not something that surprises me terribly. I've always said that I didn't think this was the right approach to negotiate in secret some of the most important decisions this nation has to make. In truth, we've never been in a more severe financial condition than we are today. Many remember the government shutdown in the 90s and the fact that the nation ended up out of that difficult, contentious time balancing the budget in 3 years. Well, I studied the Budget Committee as the presiding officer, as an able member of the Budget Committee. We know it is not going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult to get this country on the right financial course. And so I think the decision of the House Majority Leader and Senator Kyl to withdraw from the negotiations over the debt ceiling underscores the inherent problems, with these kind of non-public meetings designed to come up with some global comprehensive settlement of apparently all our financial difficulties. And it's just not easily. I think it underscores additionally a very important fact, that a president cannot lead from behind in dealing with the most pressing crisis our nation faces, our exploding debt and the increasing damage that debt is actually doing now to the American economy. So it's taking too long for a proposal to be presented to the Congress, and it's clear now that optimistic statements about existing progress has been too generous. It will be unacceptable for the White House talks or any talks to produce a controversial decision at the 11th hour and for them to come before Congress all in a panic and say, you've got to pass this solution that we have come up with in secret or the country will have a debt crisis of some kind. And that was a path we were heading on, just like was done with the CR, frankly, the continuing resolution that was passed. That's not what the American people want. That's not what they deserve. They want a regular order. They want Congress to have the opportunity to vote and debate. And if it takes weeks, and it should take weeks for us to work through a challenge as serious as this one is, so be it. It just takes weeks. If it takes hundreds of votes, people going on record, being criticized back home by one group or another for the vote that they cast, so be it. That's what we're paid to do. And we're not guaranteed re-election. That's basic to me. Congress and the American people deserve a full opportunity to review and consider any debt limit deal that is struck behind closed doors. And it's also been reported in one publication, at least, that in order to make the numbers look better, we're going to resort to certain gimmicks. In other words, if you cut a program, let's say you eliminate a program that's a $100 million program. Well, we've been talking about how much that would save over 10 years, whether it would save $100 million for 10 years. That would be $1 billion. But one of the gimmicks that got floated around and was used in some of the president's numbers all of a sudden, without much comment, that we're going to do it over 10 years. So it would be $1.2 billion. You hadn't cut any more. You just added a couple of years to the time frame that you're considering, and it makes it look better, but it's no better. We've had gimmicks in which a big payment, a military payment to soldiers or Social Security payment falls near the end of the month. They push it over into the next fiscal year, September 30th. It's due. They make it payable October 1st, and your numbers look better. You don't have that expenditure, but it's still out there. The money's still going to be spent. Nothing has really been changed except a date or two when the money is paid. So gimmicks are unacceptable. Any plan that's presented to this floor, however it comes forward, must be free of gimmicks and accounting tricks. It must be honest, an honest budget, fact-based budget. Additionally, raising the debt ceiling should not be accomplished by tax hikes. A punishing tax increase would not only threaten the needed growth that we have to have in our economy, it would also give a free pass to the egregious overspending in Washington. It would bail out the big spending excesses that have occurred here. Overspending is a behavior that's really been morally and economically culpable for our current crisis. Federal government spending already controls nearly 25% of our economy. It amounts to that much, the highest we've ever had. Some of that's because the economy is down. Some of that's because spending is up. But 25% of the economy is now driven by the federal government with tax money and borrowed money. 60% of what they spend is tax money. 40% plus is borrowed. We take in $3.7 trillion. We take in $2.2 trillion. We spend $3.7 trillion. And that's why all the experts tell us, and we know it's so, this is unsustainable. That's why it's not business as usual. That's why we've got to do something. That's why the House of Representatives produced a budget that cut spending. And some people didn't like it. But unless you have massive tax increases, and they won't last, or they won't continue to produce, the economy will be damaged by them. Unless you do big tax increases, you've got to reduce spending, right? Certainly that's correct. So that's where we are. And the difficulty is the amount of money and debt and spending that's projected by the Congressional Budget Office as they have analyzed the budget, at least presented by the President, and the current state of spending, if it were just continued, are very dramatically dangerous. They're sending us on an even worse path. And the President did submit a budget to the Congress. I offered it, and it was voted down 97-0. It made the debt path that we were on, already an utterly unacceptable debt path, much worse. Indeed, would have doubled the entire debt of the country again from $14 trillion, $13 trillion to $27 trillion in 10 years. That's the path he projected. And the debt in the outer years would be going up, not down, an unsustainable path. So ultimately, the numbers we've been hearing, like $2 trillion in reduction, is not sufficient. It's only a part of what we'd have to do to get our country on a sound fiscal path. Well, you hear this figure, we need $2 trillion in cuts. The House budget, a lot of people don't understand this. I hope my colleagues have picked up, have grasped it, but the House budget reduces spending by $6 trillion over the next 12 years. By the way, over the next 12 years, we're projected to add $13 trillion to the national debt, on top of the $13 trillion that at the time it would have started, doubling it. So cutting $6 trillion is a pretty good thing in terms of size of cuts, and it requires us to take real firm action. Some people are uneasy. They think that we can't cut that much, but your states and cities and counties have been cutting on a percentage basis more than that, many of them, and they're still going to be there, and they're still going to survive, but they know they have to live within their means, but Washington has not gotten that message. It's rumored that Democratic budget cuts that have been proposed or were worked on in these meetings would amount to only about $1.5 trillion. That's according to the reports. They've tried to make the number bigger by counting interest savings, including those from tax hikes, which is the way they've calculated that is a gimmick. $1 in spending cuts is not equivalent to $1 in tax hikes. It's just simply not. Cutting spending restores economic confidence and makes room for the private sector growth. Studies show such an approach results in more significant deficit reduction. Cutting spending allows us to pursue a more competitive tax code. Hiking taxes is a less successful way to trim the deficit. It just is. That's reality. Hiking taxes punishes families for the waste of Washington, and it perpetuates our bloated government that needs to be trimmed and whipped into shape. Raising taxes to pay for excessive government spending is a refusal to recognize that there are limits to how much we can spend and how much we can tax. There is a limit to how much we can spend and how much we can tax. and be a government of democratic ideals, freedom, free markets, limited government, as we were founded to be, a plan to reduce the deficit $4 trillion that only cuts $2 trillion in actual spending contains only a fraction of the savings that we can and must achieve. And that's my firm view. So I think we have a great deal of people in Washington, including, I have to say, our president, who is in denial about the challenges we face, the difficulties we face. This is not a situation in which a few little cuts here and there can put us on the path to fiscal solvency and get us off the path to fiscal destruction. It's going to take more, stronger steps, the kind of steps they're taking in New York State, the kind of steps Governor Christie is taking in New Jersey. We're not even reaching the level of cuts that Governor Brown has achieved in California, or what the Brits are doing in the UK. We've got to wise up. We cannot continue on this path. Let me share a few other thoughts about debt, because debt is a dangerous thing. It hurts us right now. Most of us, we've gotten into the habit of saying we're worried about our children and our grandchildren, and certainly we are about their future because of the debt burden that we are running up and placing on their shoulders. But the truth is, the debt threatens us right now. It is a danger to our economy. In addition to being a danger, it is a drag on the economy. So let me explain how debt destroys jobs and why this Congress should pass a budget, this Senate should pass a budget. The House of Representatives has passed a budget. They made it public, and they've defended it and explained it. Let's see what the Senate Democratic majority here will do about a budget. Higher debt leads to slower economic growth. Empirical studies show that high levels of government debt inhibit economic growth by creating uncertainty, displacing needed private investment, and placing upward pressure on interest rates and raising burden on the government itself through debt interest payments. For example, the very well-respected and much commented upon study by Reinhardt and Rogoff, Harvard and University of Maryland economists, found that in advanced economies with gross government debt above 90% of GDP, a total debt equal to 90% or above of the size of the American economy, median economic growth tends to be between 1% and 2% lower, depending on the time period analyzed, when compared to countries with lower debt-to-GDP ratios. Now, what do we mean by 1% to 2% lower? First quarter of this year, we're expecting almost 3% growth. It came in shockingly lower. It's impacted adversely the stock market. Second quarter may not be so good either. What did it come in at? 1.8%. Well, if we're already above 90% of debt to GDP, so presumably, if this study is accurate, then we would have been at 2.8% growth. So, in a sense, it's not a 1% reduction, it's 30% reduction of the growth that we need to have. And another study has shown that 1% growth in the gross domestic product, 1% growth in our economy creates 1 million jobs. And when asked about this Rogoff-Reinhardt study, Secretary of Treasury, President Obama's Secretary of Treasury, Timothy Geithner, told the Budget Committee he considered it an excellent study. Not only that, he told us in the committee that he thought it underestimated the problem. Because when you get debt the size of 90 to 100% of GDP, and we're projected to reach 100% of GDP as our debt by the end of this year, he said it creates a danger of an economic crisis, some sort of spasm like we had when we had the financial crisis, or something even like Greece, or something that could put us into another recession, which would be the worst thing that could happen to our economy. So this is why this is serious business. We're feeling the impact of this debt right now. It's pulling down economic growth. It's costing us jobs. It's creating uncertainty and fear in the marketplace. We have got to get off of it. President Obama appointed the Fiscal Commission, co-chaired by Alan Simpson, our former senator, and Erskine Bowles, former chief of staff to President Clinton. Erskine Bowles and Mr. Simpson, Senator Simpson, told us at the Budget Committee that we are facing the most predictable debt crisis in this nation's history, most predictable economic crisis in our nation's history. In other words, they explained that the debt trajectory we're on guarantees an economic crisis. The question is when. So that's why we've got to change. We don't want to have to cut any spending. The last thing politicians want to do is cut spending. The reason we're talking about this is because we have to. And I do believe President Obama deserves severe criticism for not being out leading on this, not telling the American people his own experts are telling him. This was his expert, Mr. Bowles, his Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Geithner, telling us we've got to change the debt path we're on. He needs to help explain to the American people why this is necessary, why it'll be painful in the short run, but can put us on the road to prosperity and not on the road to decline. Other studies, including Kainer, Drennis, and Kohler-Gibbs' 2010 study of 99 countries between 1980 and 2008, reached a similar conclusion about debt. The current gross debt to GDP in the United States is about 95%, above that number. So, successful debt reduction measures relying on spending cuts, not tax increases, have consistently resulted in stronger economic growth. Research from Harvard economist Alberto Alcina, as well as a Goldman Sachs report, found that fiscal consolidations, reductions in spending, fiscal consolidations that focused on cutting government spending, including on subsidies, transfer payments, and government worker pensions, were successful in cutting fiscal imbalances, typically boosted economic growth, and were followed by improved equity, that's the stock market, and bond market performance. That's what their study found, an empirical study by Goldman Sachs and a professor from Harvard, economist Alberto Alcina, not Jeff Sessions. These are independent analyses. Examples of successful spending reductions include Canada, who's doing so far above what we're doing. We're at 9.1% unemployment, and our unemployment numbers still seem to be going up, whereas Canada is about 7.1% and going down. And New Zealand. They had a dramatic turnaround in New Zealand in the early 90s. They went from 22 consecutive years of deficit spending to now 16 years of surpluses. And it was a deliberate, systematic decision by the people of New Zealand through their government to change what they were doing. They reduced spending. They created ways to make sure the government was productive and saved money. They privatized a lot of activities that the government had taken over that didn't need to be government functions, and the country has been continuously progressing solidly ever since. Financial markets have issued dire warnings about the consequences of our inaction. Against the backdrop of a spreading Eurozone debt crisis, the International Monetary Fund, they certainly are not a right-wing organization. The International Monetary Fund recently urged the United States to act swiftly to address its soaring budget deficits, saying, quote, "You cannot afford to have a world economy where these important decisions are postponed," close quote. The credit rating agencies Moody's and S&P have warned that they may place the U.S. government's AAA debt rating, bond rating, under review for a possible downgrade within months. Bill Gross, the head of PIMCO, the largest bond fund in the world with hundreds of billions of dollars invested, has ceased buying U.S. government treasuries. None of that's in his portfolio. He says recently what we're doing with our economy, with the Fed, with this quantitative easing, and the government with this worthless stimulus package that this Congress passed, it's done really nothing. He called it a sugar high. Not real. A temporary surge that has not changed the circumstances we're in. He's a man who deals every day with investments, and he's ceased to invest in United States treasuries. Yet the nation has operated without a budget now for 785 days. The Democrat-led Senate, even when they had a 60-vote majority last year, perhaps the biggest majority in maybe my lifetime. I can't remember a party having 60 votes in the Senate when that last occurred, but you can pass a budget with 50 votes. It's given a priority. We know we need a budget, so we set up a budget act that allows even a bare majority of senators to pass a budget, and it helps contain spending and sets a plan for our Congress. So the Senate has not even allowed the Budget Committee to meet this year to begin work on a budget resolution. The Budget Act calls for the Budget Committee to meet by April 1st. It calls for the Congress to pass a budget by April 15th. The House has passed their budget by April 15th. We've not yet had a hearing, not even had a hearing to work on a budget resolution. And the leadership here in the Senate has refused to pass a budget at all since April 29, 2009. 785 days. We wonder why this country is in a financial crisis. We won't even get together to pass a budget that every city and county and state has, to my knowledge. Maybe there's some that don't. I don't know one that doesn't. Over this time that we haven't passed the budget, the nation has spent $7.1 trillion and added $3.2 trillion to the gross federal debt. Majority Leader, my friend Harry Reid, I know he has a tough job, but he made a big mistake. He recently said it would be foolish for the Democrats to produce a budget. Foolish to produce a budget? Is this the kind of leadership the American people expect out of Washington, that the #1 senator, the majority leader, the leader of the majority party, who has the power to control the flow of legislation in this body, says he's not about to produce a budget? Indeed, he says it's foolish to produce one. He's basically sent the word to the Budget Committee we're not to even have committee hearings. Well, I think nothing could be more foolish than refusing to provide the nation's job creators, investors, and taxpayers with a solid blueprint for our fiscal future in which the American people can see that we've got it. We understand the debt course we're on is unsustainable, and now we've got a plan to get us off that. Why wouldn't the people who want to be in the majority, who've asked to lead, why won't they step forward and lead? Why won't they lay forth a plan that can be analyzed and shown to the American people? Why aren't they proud to present their vision for what America should be like and how we should handle their future? So I would just say, in conclusion, that the breakdown of the talks does not surprise me. The Gang of Six tried, and those talks seem to have fallen apart. Then we went to the Biden talks, and once again, people said that we were about to reach an agreement any minute that was going to, all the rest of us senators could just relax, and all we need to do is walk up and sign our name to what these wise few have decided our financial future should be like. But I think most of us feel like we were elected. We're United States senators. We're not rubber stamps for Vice President Biden and some of our fine colleagues. Presiding officer is an independent American citizen. He's going to make up his own mind. So do I. But when you're talking about a budget, a financial plan, a program to raise the debt ceiling in this Congress, we ought to read it. We ought to know what's in it. Not only us. The American people should know what's in it. They need to have time to absorb what it means for them and their future. There be no gimmicks and tricks, and honestly presented, and that takes some time. So I'm worried and have been worried that if they reach an agreement, even if it's a somewhat good agreement, I don't expect it to be a great one, but a decent agreement is made, it's going to be brought forward, and we've got to pass it within days because of panic that we have an economic problem if we don't raise the debt limit and we can't spend so much money. I don't think we should head that way. So I don't know what's going to happen now. So it's late, I'll acknowledge, for us to go back to the regular order and have Budget Committee hearings and amendments in the Budget Committee, have people stand up before the world and explain their view and offer amendments. I don't think it's necessarily too late. So I don't know where it will go. But this has not been a shining hour for the United States Senate. And after this last election, in which the senators and House members took a shellacking by the American people who are very unhappy with us, the House, I think, appears to have at least gotten the message. They put forth an honest budget that changes the debt trajectory, and they put it forth and explained it and defended it. And what do we have in the Senate? We have the majority leader saying it's foolish for us to produce a budget. We're not going to produce a budget. Did he mean it's foolish for America? No, he meant it's foolish for political reasons. He meant it was foolish for us as Democrats to step forward and lay out an honest plan because, wow, that plan may include tax increases. It might include spending reductions, and it may not reduce the deficit very much. And we'd have to defend that to the American people, and we might not be able to defend it. And people might be unhappy with us like they were in the last election. And so let's just be clever. Let's don't us produce a budget. Let's let Mr. Ryan and the House people lead with their chin. Let them come out and make a plan, and we'll just attack it. That's the Democratic leadership we've seen in this Senate. And it's not legit, it's not justified leadership. It's irresponsible. And the President has not been engaged. He doesn't want to talk about it. He's not explained it in his State of the Union address. He's not really talked to the American people consistently about why His own Debt Commission Chairman, Mr. Erskine Bowles, says we're facing the most predictable economic crisis in our history. No, he doesn't want to talk about that. Why? Because once you talk about it, it becomes obvious that spending needs to be cut. And it becomes obvious that you can't fix your way out of this by raising taxes. And if you're a tax and spender, you don't want to deal with that reality, in my view. So I'm worried about it. I don't know where we're heading today, Mr. President. Senator Reid's a good man. Senator McConnell is a good leader on our side. I don't know what Speaker Boehner is going to do, what Vice President Biden will do. But the time, as old Snuffy Smith, the mountaineer, used to say, time's a-wasting. The deadline's coming closer and closer. We're going to have to figure out something that helps solve the national interest of this country. And I hope we can do it sooner rather than later. I would thank the Chair and would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.